It was a cool afternoon in London, and the streets near Buckingham Palace were filled with people. Some were tourists taking pictures, some were families enjoying their day, and some were just sitting quietly on benches. Among them sat an older man named Henry. He was a retired army veteran who had served his country many years ago. His body was not as strong as before, and his breathing often became heavy because of his asthma. But he loved to visit the open square near the palace. Watching people made him feel alive. He often said that the sound of footsteps and laughter made him forget his loneliness. Henry wore his old military jacket. It was faded but clean, and he wore it proudly. It carried medals that showed his years of service. Sometimes people smiled at him when they saw the medals, and he smiled back politely. He was gentle and kind, a man who had seen hard times but still carried calmness in his eyes. He always carried a small inhaler in his pocket. It was his constant companion, the thing that helped him breathe when his chest became tight. That day, Henry sat near the edge of the square, looking at the famous royal guards standing still by the gates. He admired their discipline. They never moved, even when people shouted jokes to make them laugh. He respected them, because he knew what it meant to hold your position no matter what happened around you. It reminded him of his own army days when he had to stay alert for hours without rest. A group of young men was also nearby. They were laughing loudly, taking pictures and making fun of others. They looked bored and restless, trying to get attention. One of them noticed Henry sitting quietly and nudged his friend. They started whispering and laughing, pointing at his jacket. Henry didn't look at them. He had seen such behavior before and knew it was better to ignore it. But the young men didn't stop. They were looking for entertainment, and sadly, they chose him as their target. They began making jokes about his jacket, calling it old and funny-looking. Henry still said nothing. He just looked at the palace gates, breathing slowly. Inside, his chest was starting to feel a little heavy. The air had become cold, and he could sense the start of an asthma flare. He put a hand in his pocket to check if his inhaler was still there. It was. That small reassurance gave him peace. He thought maybe he should go home soon before it got worse. But then one of the bullies came closer. "Hey, old man," he said in a mocking tone. "Are you pretending to be a soldier? That jacket's from the museum or what?" His friends laughed loudly. Henry looked up and said calmly, "No, son. I used to serve. It's real." His voice was soft and honest, but they didn't believe him. The one in front stepped closer and said, "Yeah, right, you serve sandwiches maybe." The others roared with laughter again. Henry didn't reply. He just stood up slowly, holding the bench for balance. His breathing was getting worse now. The cold wind made it harder to catch his breath. He took out his inhaler, but his hands were shaking slightly. That's when one of the bullies grabbed it. Henry froze for a second, not believing what had just happened. The young man held the inhaler up and laughed. "What's this? Some kind of toy?" His friends started cheering him on. Henry tried to reach for it and said quietly, "Please give it back. I need that." But they didn't take him seriously. They tossed it between themselves, laughing as Henry tried to move closer. Each step was hard for him. He felt his chest tightening, his lungs crying for air. The world around him blurred for a moment. He stumbled and leaned on a nearby post, trying not to fall. Some people in the crowd saw what was happening, but they hesitated. Nobody wanted to interfere. Some looked away, pretending they didn't see anything. Others held their phones, unsure whether to record or help. Henry tried to stay calm. He had been in difficult situations before, in the army and in life. But this was different. This was not a battlefield. This was helplessness. He could hear the laughter of the bullies as they continued tossing his inhaler. One of them shouted, "Come on, catch it, soldier!" But Henry couldn't even move quickly. His breathing was short and painful. He bent forward, clutching his chest, and the color started to fade from his face. Not far away across the square, one of the royal guards stood at his post. He had been watching the scene from the start. At first, he didn't react because he was trained not to move no matter what happened. His duty was to stand firm and silent. But as the situation grew serious, his eyes followed the veteran's struggle. He could see the man's slow movements, the trembling hands, the way his body shook as he tried to breathe. The guard's heart began to race inside his chest, but his face stayed emotionless. His orders were clear. Never break formation unless life was in danger. Henry tried to speak again, his voice breaking. "Please, my inhaler." But the boys just looked at each other, unsure if it was still part of the fun. One of them laughed nervously and said, "Relax, old man, we're just joking." But Henry's knees gave way. He fell to the ground, coughing and gasping for air. His mind was spinning and sounds around him faded. The bullies froze, realizing it was no longer a joke. People nearby started shouting and some ran toward him. From his post, the guard's body stiffened. He wanted to move, to help, but discipline held him in place. He was trained to stay motionless, yet every part of him wanted to act. His grip tightened on his rifle. He could see the inhaler lying near the bully's feet. His training told him to wait, but his conscience told him to act. The guard had seen many visitors come and go, but something about this scene struck him deeply. Maybe it was the veteran's jacket. Maybe it was the look of helplessness on his face. Or maybe it was because deep inside, a soldier never forgets another soldier. Henry's vision blurred, but he could still see the red uniform of the guard in the distance. It gave him a strange sense of comfort. He thought of his old comrades, of moments when they helped each other during tough times. His breathing grew faint, but he tried to whisper for help again. The bullies finally dropped the inhaler on the ground, stepping back in guilt and confusion. One of them muttered, "We didn't mean it to go this far." The crowd began to gather. A woman knelt beside Henry, trying to comfort him. "Hang on, sir, help is coming," she said softly. Henry nodded weakly, his eyes half open. His world was fading into a gray haze, but he still held on to one thought. He had faced worse, and he would survive this too. He always did. The guard took a deep breath. His training echoed in his mind, but his heart had already made a choice. He couldn't stand still any longer. His feet shifted slightly, the sound of his boots echoing faintly against the stone. A nearby tourist noticed the movement and gasped, pointing toward him. The guard's eyes were locked on the scene. The moment of decision was coming, and the crowd didn't know that they were about to witness something few ever saw. A royal guard breaking his silence for a reason that went beyond duty. The bullies stood frozen now, no longer laughing. The fun was over, replaced by fear and guilt. Henry lay still on the ground, struggling for each breath. The palace clock struck the hour, the bells ringing across the square. The sound carried through the air like a call to action, and even though Henry's eyes were closing, the last thing he saw was the figure of the guard watching him closely, unmoving yet full of silent power. That single look, steady, calm, and unblinking, carried something no words could express. It wasn't pity. It was respect. And before the crowd could realize what was about to happen next, the story of courage and honor was already beginning to unfold. Henry was still lying on the cold ground. His body trembled as he tried to breathe. His lips had turned pale, and every breath sounded like a faint whistle. The woman beside him held his shoulder gently, telling him to stay calm. She shouted for help, hoping someone nearby would come forward. But people mostly stood around, unsure what to do. Some took small steps closer, while others just stared, frozen by fear and confusion. The bullies stood a few feet away, no longer laughing. Their faces had lost all the fun and boldness they had a few minutes ago. They looked at each other, not knowing what to do next. The inhaler lay near their feet, untouched, but none of them dared to pick it up. The situation had changed too quickly. What started as a cruel joke was now a serious emergency. The leader of the group whispered, "We should leave." But one of the others said quietly, "We can't. People saw us." The fear in their voices showed they were realizing how wrong they had been. Across the square, the royal guard still stood in his position. His tall figure, dressed in the red uniform and black bearskin hat, was like a statue of honor. But inside that uniform, his heart was beating fast. His eyes never left Henry. He had seen enough to understand that this was not a minor problem. The man on the ground needed help immediately. The guard knew he wasn't supposed to move unless life was in danger. And now, life clearly was. Henry tried to reach out with his hand, searching for the inhaler, but it was too far. His fingers barely brushed the stone surface of the ground. He whispered weakly, "Please, help." The sound was so soft that only the woman beside him heard it. She looked around desperately, shouting again, "Somebody please get his inhaler." Her voice broke through the crowd. For a moment, everything seemed still. Even the wind paused. Then the sound of heavy boots broke the silence. Every head turned toward the direction of the palace gates. The guard, the one who had been watching, suddenly moved. His first step echoed like thunder on the stone path. The crowd gasped. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was rare, almost unheard of, for a royal guard to break formation. They were known for their strict discipline, for never reacting to anything around them. But this one was walking straight toward Henry. The bullies froze in fear. One of them whispered, "Oh no, he's coming here." The leader took a step back, his face turning pale. The crowd began to part slowly, making way for the guard. His walk was steady and firm. Every step was measured, confident, and full of purpose. He didn't rush, but there was a quiet power in his movement. His face was still calm, but his eyes showed determination. Henry was barely conscious now. He could hear the echoing sound of the guard's boots getting closer. It was strange. That sound, which used to be part of the palace routine, now felt like the rhythm of hope. The woman beside him whispered softly, "Hold on, sir. Help is coming." Henry blinked slowly, trying to stay awake. He could see the red blur of the uniform approaching through his fading vision. The guard reached the group of young men. He stopped in front of them, his tall figure casting a long shadow. The bullies couldn't look him in the eyes. His voice was calm, deep, and steady when he finally spoke. "Give me the inhaler," he said. The words were not loud, but they carried weight. Nobody dared to argue. The leader bent down quickly, picked up the inhaler from the ground, and handed it to him without saying a word. The guard took it, checked it quickly, and turned toward Henry. The crowd watched in complete silence. Some started recording with their phones, but most just stood there amazed. The guard knelt beside Henry, breaking another rule that few ever dared to break. But he didn't care about rules at that moment. What mattered was saving a man's life. His movements were calm and precise. He placed one hand gently behind Henry's shoulder to help him sit up, then held the inhaler to his lips. "Breathe," he said softly. Henry tried to inhale, his chest shaking as the medicine entered his lungs. The first breath didn't come easily. He coughed weakly, then tried again. Slowly, his breathing began to improve. His chest rose and fell with less struggle. The color started to return to his face. The woman beside him sighed in relief, her eyes wet with tears. The guard stayed close, steadying him until he could breathe properly. The bullies stood silently, staring at the ground. They looked small and ashamed. The guard didn't look at them again. He didn't need to. His calm authority had already taught them a lesson they would never forget. The crowd began to murmur softly, voices filled with respect. They couldn't believe they had just witnessed a royal guard break his strict post to save a man's life. Henry looked up slowly, his voice trembling. "Thank you," he whispered. His eyes met the guard's, and though the guard said nothing, the look in his eyes was enough. It was full of understanding and respect. It was one soldier recognizing another. A few moments later, one of the palace medics arrived, running from the side gate. Someone from the crowd must have called for help. The medic knelt beside Henry, checking his pulse and breathing. "He's stabilizing," the medic said. "Good work." The guard stood up quietly, nodded once, and stepped back. His face returned to its still expression, but the emotion in the air remained heavy. The crowd began to clap softly. It started with one person, then another, until the entire square was filled with gentle applause. It wasn't loud or wild. It was a quiet kind of respect, the kind that spoke louder than words. The guard didn't react. He simply turned and began to walk back to his post. Every step he took echoed with quiet dignity. He had done what was right, and that was enough. Henry, now able to breathe more easily, watched him go. He felt a tear roll down his cheek, not from pain but from gratitude. The woman beside him smiled and said, "That man just saved your life." Henry nodded slowly. "He did more than that," he whispered. "He reminded me that kindness still exists." The bullies, unable to face anyone, slowly walked away. No one stopped them. Their shame was punishment enough. They didn't speak a word to each other as they disappeared into the crowd. Deep inside, they knew this moment would stay with them forever. As the guard returned to his position, he resumed his still posture. It was as if nothing had happened. But for everyone who had seen it, it was unforgettable. The tourists whispered to each other about the bravery and compassion they had just witnessed. Some even wiped tears from their eyes. A few guards inside the palace, watching through the gates, exchanged silent glances of admiration. They all knew what it meant for one of their own to break formation. It meant something truly important had happened. Henry sat on the bench again after the medic helped him recover. He looked at the palace gates where the guard now stood motionless once more. The afternoon sun touched the top of the palace and everything seemed peaceful again. The chaos of moments ago had turned into quiet gratitude. He whispered to himself, "People see them as statues, but they have hearts too." He looked around at the people who had witnessed it. Some were smiling warmly, others were still in awe. But everyone shared one feeling of respect. The woman who had helped him asked softly, "Do you want me to call someone for you?" Henry smiled faintly and said, "No, thank you. I just want to sit for a while." He looked down at his inhaler, holding it tightly in his hand. It wasn't just a medical tool anymore. It was now a symbol of hope, a reminder that even when the world turns cruel, there are still people who stand up for what's right. As the hours passed, the square slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The crowd changed, the laughter returned, and the sound of footsteps filled the air again. But for Henry, that moment would never fade. Every time he looked at the guard, he remembered the courage behind the stillness, the compassion behind the uniform, and deep in his heart, he made a silent promise that he would come back here again not just to watch the guards, but to remember that one man who chose humanity over routine, a man who showed that even the strongest rules can bend when kindness calls. The square around Buckingham Palace slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. Tourists began to move again, the sound of footsteps echoing softly on the stones. The royal guard who had broken his stillness was back at his post. He stood tall, his expression calm and steady as if nothing unusual had happened. But deep inside him, the moment still replayed in his mind again and again. His name was James Turner, a soldier who had served in the Royal Guard for 6 years. Every day of his service had been built around discipline and duty. He had trained to remain perfectly still through cold, rain, heat, and endless distractions. He was proud of that discipline. But what had happened a few minutes ago had shaken something inside him. Not fear, but emotion. He had seen a man fighting for breath, a veteran just like many he had met before, and his heart had refused to stay silent. He thought about the veteran's eyes, full of pain, but also pride. Those eyes reminded him of his late father, who had also served in the army decades ago. His father had once told him, "Son, a true soldier never walks away when someone needs help." Those words had guided him in that instant. Even though his duty demanded silence, his conscience had demanded action. Back on the bench, Henry sat quietly, still holding his inhaler. His breathing was steady now, but his heart was heavy with mixed feelings. He couldn't stop thinking about how the young men had treated him. But more than that, he couldn't forget the kindness of the guard. The red uniform stood out among the crowd, and even from a distance, Henry felt safe just looking at it. People still whispered around the square, talking about what they had seen. Some told the story in awe, how a royal guard had stepped out of line to help a man in need. Others said it showed the true spirit of honor. A few even called it a rare sight of duty and heart meeting together. Tourists had taken photos and short clips, and soon enough those began to spread among people nearby. James could hear faint murmurs from behind the gates, where other guards stood hidden. He knew that when his shift ended, he would likely have to explain himself to his superior officers. Breaking formation was serious even when done for the right reason. Yet as he stood there, he didn't regret it. Not even for a second. He knew in his heart he had done what was right. Henry slowly stood up, still weak but determined. The woman who had helped him earlier offered her arm, but he smiled gently and said, "Thank you, miss. I'll be all right." He looked toward the guard again. The crowd had thinned, and now it was easier to see him clearly. Henry felt something deep inside, a mix of gratitude and admiration. He wanted to thank the man properly, not just with words shouted across a crowd. He started walking slowly toward the palace fence, his steps small and careful. The guard's eyes followed him discreetly. Henry stopped near the black iron railing that separated the public from the guarded area. He raised his hand in a slow salute. It was not a sharp military salute, but one filled with emotion and respect. For a moment, James stood motionless. Then, in a gesture so subtle that only Henry noticed, he blinked once, slow, deliberate, like an unspoken acknowledgement. That single moment said everything that words could not. The sun began to set, and the golden light covered the square in a soft glow. Henry sat back on the bench, watching as the shadows grew longer. The chill in the air made him pull his coat tighter. He thought of his days in the army, the marches, the long nights, the friends he had lost. He remembered his promise to himself after leaving the service, to stay strong no matter what. That promise had kept him going even through the lonely years. As evening settled, Henry decided to leave. He took one last look at the guard and whispered, "Thank you, soldier." Then he turned and began the slow walk back home. That night, James finished his shift and returned to the guard quarters. The moment he stepped inside, one of his fellow guards greeted him quietly. "You did the right thing out there." James nodded but didn't speak. He wasn't looking for praise. He knew it would be talked about, maybe even questioned by higher officers. But he didn't care. He took off his bearskin hat, sat on the wooden bench in the corner, and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace with his conscience. The next morning, the story had already spread. Visitors who had recorded the scene posted about it online. Pictures of the guard kneeling to help the old veteran appeared on social pages with words like "true hero in uniform" and "honor beyond duty." Within hours, people across the city were talking about it. Henry, meanwhile, woke up feeling much better. He made himself a cup of tea and sat by the window, looking out at the street below. He wasn't aware that his story was already reaching thousands of people. For him, it was personal, a moment between two men who understood what service and compassion meant. But when he turned on his small television later that day, he saw the headline, "Royal Guard breaks formation to save asthmatic veteran." His eyes widened in surprise. There was a still image of the moment, the guard kneeling beside him, helping him breathe. Henry leaned back in his chair, smiling softly. He whispered he didn't want fame, he just did what was right. At the same time, in the guard headquarters, James was called into the supervisor's office. His superior, Captain Brooks, was a stern man known for his strictness. As James entered, the captain looked up from his desk. "Turner," he said in a firm tone, "I heard you broke formation yesterday." James stood straight, answering clearly, "Yes, sir." "I did." There was silence for a moment. Then the captain leaned back and asked, "Why?" James looked him in the eyes and said, "Because I saw a man who served his country struggling for his life. I couldn't stand and do nothing." The captain didn't speak for a few seconds. Then he gave a slow nod. "I see. You know the rules, Turner. But I also know what honor means. You didn't bring shame to the uniform, you brought respect." James stood silently, unsure what to say. The captain continued, "You'll receive an official note for breaking protocol. But between you and me, well done, soldier." His voice softened slightly at the end. When James stepped out of the office, he felt relief. He knew he had been forgiven in spirit, even if the paperwork said otherwise. Later that week, Henry decided to visit the palace again. He carried a small note in his pocket. It was a simple thank you letter written in his own handwriting. He reached the square and looked around, hoping to see the same guard. The crowd was larger than before, more people than usual, likely because of the story that had gone around. Tourists were taking pictures near the gates, pointing at the guards, wondering which one had saved the veteran. And then Henry saw him. James was at his post again, motionless, eyes straight ahead. Henry smiled and walked closer to the railing. He didn't speak. He just placed the folded letter on the edge of the fence where the palace attendants usually collected items from visitors. He whispered softly, "For the soldier who remembered what it means to be human." The attendant later picked up the letter and brought it inside. That evening, when James ended his shift, he found the note placed on his bunk. He opened it carefully. Inside, the short message read, "To the guard who saved me, thank you for seeing me as more than a stranger. You reminded me that courage still wears a uniform." James folded the letter slowly and kept it in his wallet. He knew he would carry it for the rest of his life. From that day, every time he stood at his post, he felt a quiet strength inside him. The uniform still meant duty, but now it also meant compassion. He understood that being a soldier wasn't just about standing still or following orders. It was about protecting, helping, and caring, even when nobody asked you to. And in the heart of London, among the noise of tourists and the old stone walls of the palace, two men, one old, one young, had shared a moment that restored people's faith in simple goodness. A few days passed after the incident, but people still talked about the Royal Guard and the veteran near Buckingham Palace. Newspapers and online pages shared pictures of the scene, calling it a moment of real honor. Some people even visited the palace just to see if they could find the same guard. Tourists stood by the gates longer than usual, whispering and pointing, guessing which of the guards it might be. James Turner, the guard who had helped Henry, stayed calm and quiet as always. He didn't talk much about what happened. His fellow guards respected him even more, but they didn't ask questions. They all knew that sometimes the bravest acts were the ones that needed no words. Every morning before duty, James would open his locker, and inside was Henry's letter, neatly folded and kept safe. Before putting on his bearskin hat, he would read it once silently. The words reminded him why he wore the uniform. It wasn't only about guarding walls or standing still. It was about protecting people and values, courage, kindness, and respect. Henry, on the other hand, felt stronger each day. The attack had shaken him, but it also awakened something inside him: hope. He had spent years thinking the world had forgotten kindness, that people no longer cared about what was right. But that one moment changed his heart. The image of the guard kneeling beside him stayed fresh in his mind. He thought about how that single act of compassion had reminded everyone watching that humanity still mattered. One morning, Henry decided to visit the palace again. He dressed carefully in his old jacket, the same one he had worn that day. He polished the small medals pinned on the side. As he looked in the mirror, he smiled at his reflection and whispered, "Let's go see the man who didn't turn away." When he reached the palace square, the crowd was as lively as ever. The guards were at their posts, perfectly still, standing like statues in their red uniforms. Henry walked slowly toward the same bench where everything had happened. He sat down and looked around. It felt peaceful now, but memories of that frightening afternoon came rushing back. The cold, the laughter, the fear, and finally the calm voice of the guard who saved him. A young boy and his mother were sitting nearby. The boy noticed Henry's medals and asked shyly, "Sir, are you a soldier?" Henry smiled and nodded. "I used to be," he said kindly. The boy's mother smiled too and said, "He's probably seen more bravery than all of us together." Henry chuckled softly and replied, "Bravery isn't about fighting. It's about doing what's right when it's hard." As the boy listened, he pointed toward the guards. "Is one of them your friend?" Henry looked at the tall figure standing near the left gate. He recognized the posture, the stance, and the quiet strength. "Yes," Henry said softly. "One of them is a man I owe my life to." The boy looked amazed. "Really, the guards don't move for anyone?" Henry smiled again. "Sometimes when the heart speaks louder than rules, even a guard moves." A small group of tourists nearby overheard his words. One of them recognized Henry from the news picture. Soon people began whispering, "That's the veteran." Henry didn't mind the attention. He just kept his eyes on the guard, feeling gratitude. Inside the palace, Captain Brooks was walking along the hallway when he received a call from a local journalist. The story of the guard had reached beyond London now. People from other countries were writing about it, calling it a symbol of British honor. Brooks smiled quietly. He had been strict his whole life, but even he felt proud of the young man under his command. Later that afternoon, when the guards rotated positions, James finally stepped away from his post. The change of duty gave him a short break. As he walked past the fence, he saw Henry sitting on the bench. Their eyes met for the first time since that day. Henry stood up slowly, smiling warmly. James approached the fence, standing tall as always. "Good afternoon, sir," he said politely. His tone was calm, but his eyes were gentle. Henry nodded. "Good afternoon, young man," he replied. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me." James smiled faintly. "Some faces you never forget," he said. Henry reached into his pocket and took out a small folded paper. "I brought you something," he said. "It's not much. Just a few words from an old soldier to a young one." James didn't move from his side of the fence, but a palace attendant standing nearby took the letter from Henry and handed it to him. James unfolded it slowly. Inside, Henry had written only one line this time. "You didn't just save my breath. You restored my faith." James read the line twice, then looked up. "Thank you, sir," he said softly. "That means more than you know." Henry smiled. "You know, in my time we were taught that heroes come with medals and honors. But sometimes the real heroes are the ones who don't need any of that." James nodded, his voice steady but emotional. "I just did what felt right." Henry chuckled gently. "That's what makes it right." The two men stood there quietly for a moment, separated by the black iron fence, yet deeply connected by something stronger: respect. Around them, tourists continued to walk by, unaware of the simple exchange taking place. But for both of them, it was one of the most meaningful moments of their lives. As the evening bells began to ring, Henry turned to leave. "Take care of yourself, son," he said. James gave a respectful nod. "And you, sir. Thank you for your service." Henry walked away slowly, his steps steady but filled with warmth. The golden light of sunset covered the square, and a gentle wind blew through the flags above the palace. Everything felt peaceful again. That night, when James returned to his quarters, he carefully placed Henry's new letter next to the first one in his wallet. He sat on his bed for a moment, thinking about what the veteran had said, about heroes, faith, and kindness. He realized that sometimes the smallest actions carried the biggest meaning. A few days later, the palace received a special envelope addressed to the Royal Guard who saved a veteran. Inside was a short note from the mayor's office, inviting James to attend a small ceremony of appreciation. It wasn't official recognition, more like a quiet thank you on behalf of the city. When Captain Brooks handed him the letter, James hesitated. "Sir, I don't need any reward," he said humbly. The captain smiled. "I know. That's why you deserve it." The ceremony took place in a modest hall near the palace grounds. There were no television cameras, no big speeches, just a few officials and a handful of guests. Henry was there too, wearing his jacket and medals. When James entered, Henry stood up straight, and the two men saluted each other once again. The mayor spoke briefly about compassion, saying, "Rules are important, but humanity is greater." James received a small framed certificate, but the real reward was the look of gratitude in Henry's eyes. When the ceremony ended, Henry patted his shoulder gently. "You've done your father proud," he said. James looked surprised. "How did you know about my father?" Henry smiled softly. "I saw it in your eyes that day, the same kind of courage he must have taught you." They both laughed quietly, like two soldiers sharing an unspoken bond that only those who serve could understand. That night, when James stood again at his post, the world felt a little brighter. The crowd still came and went. The lights still shimmered across the palace windows, and the air still carried the same chill. But inside he felt warm. He had learned that being a guard wasn't about standing still. It was about standing for something. And across the city, people who read the story felt inspired too. Many shared it with messages saying, "This is what kindness looks like," or, "The world still has good people." Henry, sitting by his window at home, smiled each time he saw the picture online. He didn't care about fame, and he knew James didn't either. What mattered was that people remembered the lesson. Compassion is never weakness. It is courage in its truest form. As the night deepened, the palace lights glowed softly against the dark sky. The guard stood silently, his eyes forward but his heart filled with quiet pride. Somewhere out there, the old veteran was breathing peacefully, alive and grateful. And between them, though miles apart, there was a silent promise that neither of them would ever forget. That kindness, once shown, never truly ends. Weeks passed since the day when a royal guard broke his stillness to save an old veteran's life. Yet the story continued to travel far beyond London. People from different cities and even other countries shared it with admiration. It wasn't a story about fame or heroism. It was a story about compassion, about one man who acted when kindness mattered most. James Turner never sought attention. He continued his duty like any other day, standing tall at his post, silent and focused. But inside his heart, something had changed. He felt a deeper purpose in every moment he stood guard. Each salute, each silent hour, reminded him that a uniform meant more than rules. It meant responsibility to protect, to care, and to stand for what is right. Henry, too, had changed in quiet ways. He began visiting the palace square regularly. Sometimes he brought small flowers and left them near the railing as a gesture of gratitude. Sometimes he simply sat on the same bench and watched the guards, smiling softly to himself. He didn't want to disturb them. He just liked being near the place where his life had been saved. Many visitors noticed the old man in the brown jacket sitting by the bench. Some recognized him from the story and would greet him kindly. Henry always replied with gentle words. "I'm just here to watch," he would say. "There's peace here." And there truly was. One afternoon, a group of school children arrived at the palace on a field trip. Their teacher pointed toward the guards, explaining their history and discipline. One curious student noticed Henry and whispered, "Is that the man from the story?" The teacher smiled. "Yes, dear. That's the veteran who was helped by one of the guards." The children looked at Henry with wide eyes. One of them, a little girl with a bright smile, walked up shyly and handed him a small handmade card. It said, "Thank you for being brave." Henry's eyes softened. He patted the child's hand and said, "It wasn't me who was brave, sweetheart. It was the man who didn't turn away." The teacher took a picture of Henry holding the card, and that image spread again, reminding people that kindness doesn't fade with time. Meanwhile, inside the palace, Captain Brooks called James into his office again. He handed him a small envelope sealed with the palace stamp. "Turner," he said with a faint smile, "this came from the top office. You might want to read it." James opened it carefully. Inside was a short handwritten note. "Your action represented not only your country but humanity itself. Well done." It was signed by an official from the royal household. James felt a deep sense of gratitude. He didn't smile or speak. He just folded the note and kept it in his wallet beside Henry's letters. Those 3 pieces of paper had now become his most valued possessions, reminders of duty, compassion, and connection. The next day, as James took his post, he noticed something familiar near the fence. It was Henry, sitting as usual, watching quietly. But this time the old man looked a little tired. His movements were slower, and his shoulders slightly hunched. James felt concerned but knew he could not break formation. He kept his eyes straight, though his heart stayed aware of the man who had become like a silent friend. Henry sat there for a long time, longer than usual. The crowd came and went, but he remained, gazing at the guards and the palace gates. His breathing seemed calm, but his eyes carried a faraway look, peaceful yet deep, as if filled with memories of a long life well lived. When the evening bells rang, Henry slowly stood up and gave one last salute toward the guards. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the soft golden light of sunset. That evening, James couldn't stop thinking about the old man. Something about that final salute felt different. It was filled with warmth, but also with a kind of goodbye. He hoped Henry was all right. A few days later, while James was having breakfast before his shift, Captain Brooks entered the dining hall carrying a small envelope. He looked serious but calm. "Turner," he said quietly, "this letter came for you from a local hospital." James took it carefully, sensing something important. He opened it, and inside was a short note from a nurse. "Mr. Henry passed away peacefully last night. Before he closed his eyes, he asked us to deliver this letter to the royal guard at Buckingham Palace who saved his life." James's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. It was written in Henry's gentle handwriting. "Dear James, if you are reading this, it means I have gone to rest. Don't be sad. You already gave me extra time. Time to breathe, to smile, and to feel proud again. You reminded me that honor still lives in the hearts of the young. Keep standing tall, son. Every time you wear that uniform, remember that one act of kindness can change a life, and it changed mine. With respect, Henry." James read the letter several times, each word carving itself deep into his heart. He folded it gently and held it close to his chest. Around him, the dining hall was silent. Even Captain Brooks lowered his head for a moment out of respect. That afternoon, James stood at his post again. The sky was cloudy and a light drizzle began to fall. The tourists held umbrellas and took pictures from a distance. None of them knew that inside one of those still guards stood a man holding back tears of both sorrow and pride. The rain touched his uniform softly, and though he didn't move, his eyes held emotion that only a few would ever understand. Later, during the changing of the guard, when his replacement arrived, James quietly stepped out of line. He walked to the edge of the fence where Henry used to sit. There, lying on the bench, was a small bunch of white flowers, probably placed by someone who knew Henry. James reached into his pocket, pulled out the letter, and placed it under the flowers. He whispered softly, "Rest well, sir. I'll keep the promise." He stood there for a few moments, not as a guard, but as a friend paying his final respect. The wind blew gently through the square, carrying the sound of the palace bells. It felt as though the whole world paused in silence for a brief second. From that day onward, James carried Henry's memory wherever he went. Whenever he saw an older veteran walking by, he would give a small, respectful nod, even if no one noticed. Sometimes, on quiet mornings before his shift, he would stop by the bench where Henry used to sit and leave a single red poppy, the flower of remembrance for soldiers. The tourists never knew who left it there, but they often took pictures of the poppy resting on the wooden bench beside the palace gates. Some said it was a symbol of friendship. Others said it was a sign of unseen gratitude. Only James knew the truth. It was a promise kept. Months passed and the story slowly faded from headlines, but not from hearts. The moment between a soldier and a veteran became a quiet legend among palace guards. New recruits were sometimes told the story as an example of what it truly meant to wear the red uniform. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the palace and the last rays of light painted the sky orange and pink, James stood in his usual spot. The crowd was smaller than usual and the air was calm. He looked toward the empty bench and smiled softly to himself. A young boy walked by with his father and stopped to look at the guards. "Dad," the boy said, "why do they stand so still?" The father replied, "Because they protect this place with honor." The boy looked up again and whispered, "Do they protect people too?" James heard the words faintly, though he didn't move. Inside his heart, he answered silently, "Yes, son, always." As the clock tower chimed and the night slowly covered the city, the royal guard continued to stand tall, silent, steady, and strong. Behind that stillness was a story of kindness that would never be forgotten. A story that began with an act of cruelty, but ended with compassion and grace. And though Henry was gone, his spirit lived on in the heart of the man who once broke his silence to save him. For some promises do not end with time. They live forever in quiet acts of goodness, waiting to remind the world that kindness is the truest form of strength.